They all fought war, commit conquest in a brutal, more violent way than that of their civilized neighbors. And if you're like, well, how is it if there's this fierce, savage, blah, 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 they wage war more brutally, how is it that these less brutal people were able to compete, were able to win? Well, a lot of them didn't have discipline. A lot of these barbarians. A lot of them, they had not really much of a military system behind the whole, we're violent and we're good at fighting. Think of it like a John Jones. Yeah, think of the barbarians as a John Jones. Former UFC light heavyweight and heavyweight champion, John Jones. Think of the barbarian way of war, the barbarian hordes, as on paper, they're great. That's fantastic accomplishments. It's got everything. Bigger, stronger, faster, more violent, more animalistic, more brutal, more prone to just smack out of his wife in front of his daughters. If you look a little deeper, you get a little further into that paper, and there are some things about John Jones that are glaring weak, like all these incredible conquests that this John Jones had, all these wonderful victories. They were against some pretty poorly matched opponents. Like we'll say, like a Chael Sonnen, who had fought at 185. Like, yeah, these Germanic barbarians, they come in and they beat a couple Roman legions. But these Roman legions, like they weren't led by Marius, they weren't led by Caesar. They weren't even really in the same level, class, or category as John Jones. You could say that all these people these barbarians fought, even the one that everybody loves, the Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. That was a loss for the barbarians, number one, but all of that guile, that ability, that just raw, pure, animalistic John Jones rage wasn't able to stand up to the discipline, organization, cohesiveness of the better, less animalistic, barbaric, brutal Roman way of warfare. Like a Tom Aspinall, we'll say. And that's what I like to call a fun analogy. It has absolutely nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I just really don't like John Jones. I think he's a real piece of shit. And I do believe in the near future, on the news or on Twitter or something, the world is going to hear about a long, long string of crimes done to white prostitutes across the country committed by John Jones. Now, I can't prove that. That's not an accusation. That's a dream I had. Anyway, that brings us to the I'm talking about. I am not a historian. These are my opinion. Shit, anything offensive is wrong, probably. Rome of the Second Punic War, and they weren't fighting Hannibal, except at Zama. That army, and then you could go later into the Principate, like the Rome of Marius and Caesar. That Rome, you could take that Rome forward for hundreds of years, more than 1,000 years, and that Roman army up any other European army in the world for sure, and likely beats many of the other militaries of the world until far, far after that, because it's like the real big separation is between modern and pre-modern to me. I'm sure, and some other nerd historian of the tribe will say, like, the dates are different or whatever in the thing. But this is, if you want to understand it, just like as a normal person, you want it to make sense, like, you want it to click, and not in the Neil deGrasse Tyson, I'm a douche type of way. Warfare changed, modern and pre-modern, when modern artillery, modern field artillery, started to be deployed on the battlefield. That's what the historians have decided was a separating factor when things changed. I think now we should add like a new one. Like after World War I, that's a whole new, warfare is just a whole new thing. It's a whole different ballgame, which is, it's difficult to really compare, let's say, like a Napoleon to a Genghis Khan or a Subutai or a Julius Caesar or an Alexander, because the wars they fought and the ways they fought them were so different. And yes, the concepts were the same, but how you went about them, the arms and functions, we'll say, were all different. was better. It was more advanced than that of Western Europe. Because it had to be. If you were, say you go to prison, right? Say you go to a prison full of a bunch of John Joneses and other nominees, other athletes. You're going to either get big and strong, or you're probably going to get in your ass. And that's the same thing that happened to the Byzantines. Because they had to clash with these titans all the time. They couldn't rely on a single thing, a single set unit that could reliably bring them victory, that they could just build up everything around. And I think that is the difference, in part, the first real major difference in why not only like the heavy cavalry of Western Europe was number one, but why it was so different, number one for a while, why it was so different in the way of war, the mindset, the theory, the decisive action, the focus on maximum slaughter in the most effective possible way developed there. Because in Western Europe, you're fighting all these other people who their main thing, their big deal, their number one is also their heavy cavalrymen. And maybe you're not going to take out, but if you can get your own heavy cavalrymen big and heavy and scary and trained enough, you might not even have to worry about like your enemies, because like you can just ride them off the field, and the piddly infantry they have. They don't have these military massive manpower pools and gigantic like trained armies that the Tang dynasty had or the caliphates had. They don't have to worry about that. But the Byzantines and everywhere else did. This is probably, this might ruffle some feathers, but I have to address this, especially now as we're moving on from, I guess, the West. For most of history, warfare in quote-unquote the East was done at a higher, more modern level, a more organized, larger scale level than in the West, usually. The militaries of the West, for most of humanity's history, have been subpar to those of the East. Now, I'm not saying every single one and all the time. Like I said earlier, Rome, the Roman legionary, is probably the best infantry force, the best heavy infantry force in human history. The Hellenic armies, like the post-Argead Hellenic armies, are among some of the finest, in my opinion, armies in history. But those are the exceptions and not the rule. It's not until much, much, much later that the European military system becomes like the thing, the meta, the dominant thing. And people think it's just, the numbers. It's not. When you have a military that can employ, we'll take the secret history of the Mongols numbers for it. If you have a military that can employ 950,000 men to the field for a campaign, you also have to have the economic, societal, etc. system behind it to support, feed, equip, pay, etc. All of that for those 950,000 men. And if you're dealing with these larger numbers and these more dangerous enemies who are much more capable, this is another thing that I think separated the quote-unquote the East from the West. If you're dealing with these enemies that can take a punch, that can really take a punch, you're not gonna get them out of there with just beating one of their generals. Like Alexander, even though this isn't like the greatest example, but the Achaemenid Persians, the Argead, Alexander III's invasion. Whereas if Alexander would have lost one battle, like really lost, that it's done, it's over. There's not another army, there's no other general that is going to come that you're going to have to worry about. Alexander's dead and we never hear about him again. Whereas the Persians, he beats like 5 massive armies, Granicus, Gaugamela, Issus, etc. And if you were going to expect that you're going to have to beat all of these armies, these massive armies that are well trained and equipped, then you're going to build your military system in a way and base your theory of warfare, your theory of battle, on dealing with those enemies, those more dangerous, more advanced enemies. Which is why, even though you may have had, when you look at it, your Western European heavy cavalrymen may have been the pinnacle of heavy cavalry, in the times that they came to it, when it came down to it, that wasn't enough against the superior military systems. Even in these other systems of the East, you still had heavy cavalry as an important part. And just like the Byzantines, it wasn't the end-all be-all. It wasn't the only thing of importance. It was an important part, but only a part of a larger whole. And it makes sense, because the East is where heavy cavalry even comes from. Like, allegedly, the Massagetae are where like the proto-cataphract came from, because when they were fighting the Persians, they started, putting more armor on their men. True heavy cavalry, what we would call heavy cavalry, would not really be a thing until the Parthians and the cataphract of the 3rd century BC. And where, yes, it was the center of the Parthians and the Sassanids. Cavalry was just played a more prominent role in other parts of the world in general. The West's idea was to kill enough quickly so that the rest will run. It's much, much more difficult to do that if there are, instead of 10,000, 15,000 enemies, and only a handful of them are professional trained armored men. If there's tens of thousands, you see, allegedly, the idea of the Civil War initially was that they were going to fight these grand Napoleonic style battles of annihilation. They were going to hit the enemy, turn the flank, they were just going to f*** them all up. But technology had improved to the point which you'd think that now that you can kill people more effectively, that'd be easier. So it seems to me like it's not the technology. It might be the point that there's now way more people on the field of battle. Look at World War I, where it seems like some people were thinking they were still going to do Napoleonic-style battles of annihilation. But if you can't do that with tens of thousands, imagine what are you going to do with hundreds of thousands or millions? You can't just have a small part of your army be trained, everything be untrained, and think that that small part is going to carry you to victory every time. Even if you were to take a good old strong force of knights and send them right at a gigantic wall of Chinese spearmen, the numbers alone are a quality in and of them. So the mindset, the theory behind war in general, and how to use heavy cavalry, and how to most effectively bring yourself victory without having it be a slog to see who can kill the most of the other side first. You gotta adapt. The East, not West, was much more focused around using these different pieces of the puzzle to accomplish their goals. And obviously, at the end of the day, the goal remained the same. You wanted to win the battle. You wanted to get rid of the threat and kill the guys. But how they went about doing that, how they achieved that final decisive victory, was completely different. The Eastern tradition, we'll say, was much more focused on breaking down, wearing down the enemy before that shock action ever even came into play, and using those combined arm tactics and superior mobility to ensure that in any situation there's some move they can make that could possibly bring them victory. And even in the East, how these things were done, how they were thought of was was different. Now, I'm not as familiar with the history of the Islamic world, so forgive me. But I do know when I think of the Islamic world isn't as much known for heavy, especially in like the earlier periods, like the big caliphate periods. It's not until the Mamluks that I can even tell you a heavy Islamic sort of cavalry. And who are the Mamluks? Fun fact. They were slave soldiers employed in the Islamic world, similar to the Ghulams. And the heavy cavalry of the Islamic world often tended to be either from a slave class with the Mamluks or the Ghulams, or later in they would trade similarly to the feudal system, trade service for land. They were also heavily armored, heavy horsemen that could perform the shock action, but they were usually armed with a bow as well. They were more mobile, more flexible, and they would grow increasingly heavier over time as they had to deal with the increasingly heavier European cavalry. Just as the Byzantine Empire, their heavy cavalry may have suffered due to the rest of the army needing to be able to perform better. I think that may have been the case in the Islamic or in the West, the rest of the world. Because if you even looking at the Ottomans, like late in the day for heavy cavalry anyway, you take like the Battle of Varna, or the Battle of Kosovo, where it's these incredibly heavy European horsemen, especially the Battle of Kosovo, the Black Knights of Serbia. The Serbian army, they have such belief that their knights can bring them victory, and probably for good reason, that's a majority of their army. And yet, even though it was better than the Ottoman heavy cavalry, the Serbian army was not as good as the Ottoman army. No matter how incredibly fascinating these heavy cavalrymen were of the West, whether it be the French knights at Agincourt, or Crécy, or at Carestis, or at Nicopolis, or there's a long list, or even where they're in the service of, like the Serbians at the Battle of Ankara. Video come on that one day. Even against this massive horde, this uncountless mass of the Timurids, who are much lighter. The Serbians, by far the heaviest units on the field, even they can't bring victory to the Ottomans. Even they aren't enough. And their whole mindset, again, was different. The only people that I can think of, the only heavy cavalry, the only heavy horsemen that I can think of that had anything even close to that Western European mindset and practice, very similar actually, would be the Rajput. And obviously they were in India. There were several different groups or clans or whatever. They're still around like the city of Mewar and some other shit. But they were like the Western Knight. Their defining tactic, their role, their goal was to hit the enemy with a lance forward charge. They had incredibly high, some might say insanely high, mindlessly high moral and personal valor. So allegedly, a lot of these people, they would rather light themselves on fire, self-immolate, than allow themselves to be captured. They were unbelievably dedicated to their honor. Now, they sounds a lot like a Western European knight, but there were many differences. And just like how that Western European heavy cavalry mindset and ideas worked a lot of the time, there were some very notable times where it didn't, and it failed disastrously. First and foremost, Rajput warfare was usually smaller scale, tribal, clan-based conflict. And usually these battles they were fighting, even though they could be like brutal and horrific, they weren't over like, we're gonna annex this. So it was more over like an honor and we want this fort and that fort sort of thing. Though they could come together and form these big armies, that's not the norm. And there are some incredible times when they did, like the first Battle of Tarian, which Muhammad of Ghazi, of the Ghurids Sultanate, I'm pretty sure. This was a first Islamic invasion of India, and there were like 70,000 alleged of these Rajput horsemen, and it's along with like elephants and others, and they win the first battle, but not the second one. And that's in the hundred, like I don't know, that's in the Middle Ages sometime. That same mindset, that same style of fighting, that same just our valor, our ability as warriors will carry us through. That won and lost them in Battle of the Tarim Basin remained for like hundreds of years to a fault. Like at the Battle of Kanwa, or you could take the Delhi Sultanate at the Battle of Chaldoran. or Pani Pat. But in both of them, the more modern Islamic forces, using gunpowder and the terrain to their advantage, absolutely slaughtered these Rajput and the Delhi Sultanate, their military, because they would just charge directly into a storm of gunfire again and again and again. Just like the French at Agincourt or Crécy would just charge straight into a fucking wall of sharpened sticks again and again and again. Or at Varna. Like, even through all the research I've done and all my autistic thinking about this, I don't understand, and I don't think I can understand that mindset. What it is that creates a person or a society of people that do that. They're not only okay with doing that, but that's like what they look forward to. That's their life. That's their jam. That no matter what, no matter how fucking stupid it might be, no matter how little value it may provide you, no matter what risk it presents to you, that you believe in yourself to such an extent that it doesn't matter if there's literally no possible fucking way that you're going to win. You're going to win. And I think that was the thing that, at a certain point, it allowed Europe to do the greatest thing that it ever did, which is form the United States of America. Moving on to our last little leg of the heavy cavalry ride, mostly China. China, Asia, the Far East, is probably the land where the best horsemen, just in general, come from. It's said, allegedly, and I don't speak Chinese, so somebody else wrote this down and I read it. So if it's wrong, it would be the person that wrote it down that's wrong and not me for repeating it. But even the Han Dynasty itself, it formed, and its whole purpose of its military was to fight the nomads. And if you're fighting nomads, who are mounted people that move around and shit on horses, they're pretty good at, mounted warfare. So you're going to want to be, or are forced to be, pretty good at mounted warfare. Otherwise, you lose northern China to the Khitan. The Jurchen-led Jin Dynasty. In the late 900s, these formerly nomadic people would smash into northern China, the Song Dynasty, and they would take about half of it. And in this the half that they got, they would discover something that would one day in the future come to fundamentally change not only warfare but the world in general, just as a whole: gunpowder. In the late 900s, definitely in the early thousands, Jin Song China were using gunpowder weapons, like early cannons, not like firing one single solid projectile, but like a really big shotgun. And they had these bombs of poison, and they had giant incendiary bombs. And there was this the Thunder Crash bomb. Just a bunch of really fucking Chinesey names for them. But all of this, what would have seemed like magic to anybody else in the world. These two, at their time, the big two militaries in the world. Perhaps maybe you have the Delhi Sultanate somewhere near there. And you have you have right around them would be the Khwarezmian Empire. Right in the 1100s till the 1400s is really where you see, in my opinion, the peak of just cavalry warfare and medieval warfare as a whole, right before you see the near instant death of pre-modern warfare as a whole. And Jin China, these Jurchen, formerly Jurchen people, and their military, as they were, nomadic, mounted people, even they, as good as they were, and the Chinese, as good as they were, as incredible as their horsemen were unable to match history's finest, not only mounted force, but in my opinion, the greatest military humanity has ever been able to produce, besides the United States of America. A military that would, through its actions, bring in that change that would lead to the modern world, that would lead to infantry coming back, that would lead to gunpowder coming to Europe and all of its consequences. That would lead to the whole sort of differences between Eastern and Western warfare being blown away. A people that would usher in the modern world, that would prove themselves as the superior theory to all others at the time, and rare flashes of this superiority hundreds of years after. And that people would be the Mongols. The people of the steppe had always waged war brutally. Their lives were hard lives, and hard places make hard people. Hard times make hard people. Well, probably aren't going to find a harder people than the Mongols of the mid-1100s. But it wasn't the harshness. They didn't have some abundance of armor. They didn't have some magical ability. But through the will of one man, one very determined individual, these people, virtually identical to every other nomads throughout history, conquered the world. They had beat other nomads. They had beat the Iron Pagoda Cavalry, if they were even around at the time, of Jin China. They definitely beat the loyal and filial troops, who were the Jin dynasty's desperate, high-paid, elite guard of usually steppe people. They beat the Islamic armies, and they beat the knights, the Europeans. And what was it that allowed them to do so? I don't know. But for some reason, in the early 1200s, these people would begin just a master class of mounted warfare. Now, they didn't have initially the money, wealth, blah, 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 metal to field like a bunch of heavy cavalry, but they had some, and they were involved in all of these incredible victories. Heavy cavalry, the thing that defined warfare, may also, in a weird, morbid sort of way, kind of help define really like just how we as people in the past viewed society, life, death, and the value of the individual. I have no idea which heavy cavalry is best, as they weren't all used to do the same thing in the same way. They weren't all fighting each other, just them, on a battlefield that offered neither of them any advantage. I think they're all pretty neat. I think they're all rather cool. Like, right now, my favorites are the Serbian Knights, the Winged Hussars, and the French Gendarmes. Those three in particular, like, even after, like, well into the modern era of warfare, that medieval knightly charge was still their go-to. And damn it, sometimes it worked out. But other times, it didn't. Because these people, the real goats, the Mongols, scared the world into figuring it out. That's all. Read a book. Stay motivated.
Not up in here!
I'm not a historian.